The dust-laden wind whipped across the Montana prairie as Nora Lancaster clutched the last letter from her father, her trembling fingers tracing the weathered edges of the paper that had traveled all the way from Boston. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new beginning had turned into a nightmare faster than a summer storm could darken the vast western sky. "You've got till sundown, Miss Lancaster." The harsh voice of Victor Rollins cut through her thoughts as he circled her small homestead. "Either you sign over the deed to your father's land, or I'll make sure you regret ever setting foot in Copper Creek." Nora lifted her chin, the strength in her blue eyes betraying none of the fear that threatened to consume her. At 22, she traveled across the country after her father's sudden death, determined to honor his dream of building a life in this untamed territory. She hadn't expected to find his land claim contested by the most powerful rancher in the county. "My father purchased this land legally, Mr. Rollins. The deed is rightfully mine." Her voice remained steady despite the danger that loomed before her like a shadow. Victor Rollins was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His cattle empire stretched across the territory, and his influence extended to every corner of Copper Creek. His weathered face twisted into a cruel smile as he stepped closer, the silver spurs on his boots jangling with each deliberate step. "Your father was a fool who didn't understand how things work out here," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This is cattle country, not farmland, and I need this parcel to complete my northern grazing route." "The law says otherwise," Nora countered, standing her ground despite the fear knotting in her stomach. Rollins laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Law out here, I am the law, Miss Lancaster. You'll learn that soon enough." As he mounted his horse and rode away, the threat lingered in the air like gunsmoke. Nora knew she had precious little time to figure out her next move. Her father's small cabin stood as the only testament to his brief time in Montana territory, that, and the 50 acres of promising land that stretched toward the foothills. The next morning dawned with a golden brilliance that belied the darkness of Nora's situation. She had spent a restless night considering her options, none of which seemed promising. With her meager savings and no allies in this strange town, her future appeared as bleak as winter on the prairie. Determined to find some solution, she saddled her mare and rode into Copper Creek. The small frontier town consisted of little more than a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings. The general store, saloon, and sheriff's office formed the nucleus of the settlement, with scattered homes and businesses spreading outward like ripples in a pond. When Nora tied her horse outside the sheriff's office, she noticed the curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing a refined Eastern woman in their midst. Her riding habit, though modest by Boston standards, marked her as an outsider. Sheriff Miller barely looked up from his desk when she entered. "Miss Lancaster, I presume, heard you'd arrived to claim your father's property." "Yes, and I've come because Victor Rollins has threatened," the sheriff held up a weathered hand. "Let me stop you right there, miss. Whatever dispute you have with Rollins is a private matter. I suggest you come to some arrangement with him." "But he's threatening to take my land by force," Nora protested, indignation coloring her cheeks. "Surely that's a matter for the law." Sheriff Miller finally met her gaze, his tired eyes reflecting years of compromise. "Miss Lancaster, Victor Rollins employs half this town and owns debts from the other half. My advice, sell him the land for whatever he's offering and take the first train back east. This country is no place for a woman alone." Dejected but not defeated, Nora left the sheriff's office with her mind racing. As she moved to untie her horse, a deep voice came from behind her. "Don't mind Sheriff Miller. He's been in Rollins's pocket since the day he pinned on that star." Nora turned to find herself facing a tall man leaning against the hitching post. His features were partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes as blue as a mountain lake. He wore simple clothes, denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest, but the revolver holstered at his hips suggested he was comfortable with its weight. "And you are," she asked, caution evident in her tone. "Blake Lawson." He tipped his hat slightly. I run a small horse ranch north of town. Your father spoke highly of you before he passed. Nora's eyes widened. You knew my father? Blake nodded, his expression softening. Charles Lancaster was a good man, had big dreams for that land of his. He glanced around the street before continuing in a lower voice. Rollins has been trying to consolidate the Northern Valley for years. Your father's refusal to sell was a thorn in his side. And now I'm that thorn, Nora said with grim realization. Seems that way. Blake straightened. Look, Miss Lancaster, Rollins isn't known for idle threats. If he said sundown, he meant it. You shouldn't be at that cabin alone tonight. Pride straightened Nora's spine. I won't be bullied off my land, Mr. Lawson. My father believed in building something here, and I intend to honor that belief. A hint of admiration flickered in Blake's eyes. Your determination does you credit, but Rollins commands a small army of ranch hands who do whatever he asks without question. He hesitated, then added, Let me help you. Why would you do that? You barely know me. Blake's gaze turned distant for a moment. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see Rollins face some opposition. Besides, your father once did me a good turn when I was in a tight spot. Nora studied him, weighing her limited options. There was something about Blake Lawson that inspired trust, despite her natural caution around strangers in this unfamiliar territory. What do you propose, Mr. Lawson? First, let me escort you back to your property, then we can discuss how to handle Rollins when he comes calling tonight. The ride back to the Lancaster homestead took them through rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers. In different circumstances, Nora might have appreciated the natural beauty surrounding them. Instead, her mind was occupied with the impending confrontation. Your father chose well, Blake commented as they crested a hill overlooking her property. This land has good water access and enough timber for building. It would make fine grazing land too, which is why Rollins wants it. It's more than that, Nora said quietly. Father wrote about creating a legacy, something that would last generations. Blake nodded thoughtfully. A worthy ambition. As they approached the cabin, Blake suddenly reined his horse to a halt, his expression darkening. Someone's been here. Nora followed his gaze and noticed the door to her cabin standing ajar. Fear clutched at her heart as they cautiously approached. Inside, they found chaos. What few possessions she had brought from Boston were strewn across the floor. Her father's desk had been overturned, its contents scattered. This is just the beginning, Blake said grimly. Rollins is sending a message. Nora knelt to retrieve a shattered picture frame containing a portrait of her parents. Her hands trembled with a mixture of fear and anger. How can he do this with impunity? Men like Rollins write their own rules out here, Blake replied, his voice hardening. But that doesn't mean we have to follow them. They spent the afternoon preparing as best they could. Blake helped Nora repair the damage to the cabin while explaining what she might expect from Rollins. He'll bring at least 4 men with him, Blake said as he fixed the broken door hinge. They'll try to intimidate you first, if that doesn't work. He let the implication hang in the air. What chance do we stand against 5 armed men? Nora asked, practicality overriding fear. Blake checked his revolver before holstering it again. I didn't say it would be easy, but sometimes standing your ground is the only option. He glanced at her. It's not too late to reconsider. You could sell the land, return to Boston. Nora shook her head firmly. This land was my father's dream. I won't let it go without a fight. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the sound of approaching horses broke the tense silence. Blake moved to the window, his expression grim. They're here, 5 riders, just as I expected. He turned to Nora. Stay behind me. Whatever happens, let me do the talking. Nora nodded, her throat too dry for words. They stepped onto the small porch just as Victor Rollins and his men reined to a stop in the yard. Well now, isn't this touching? Rollins called out, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Blake. Lawson, I should have known you'd stick your nose in where it doesn't belong. Evening, Rollins, Blake replied evenly. Seems to me Miss Lancaster has the right to entertain whatever guests she chooses on her property. Rollins dismounted, his men following suit. They spread out in a loose semicircle, hands resting near their holstered weapons. The tension in the air was palpable, like the electricity before a lightning strike. "Miss Lancaster and I have business to conclude," Rollins said, his false pleasantness more menacing than an outright threat. "I believe sundown was our agreed deadline." "There was no agreement," Nora said, stepping forward despite Blake's warning glance. "This land belongs to me legally and rightfully." Rollins's smile disappeared. "I tried to be reasonable, offered you fair market value. But some people need to learn the hard way how things work in Montana territory." He nodded to one of his men, who produced a document from his jacket. "This is a bill of sale. Sign it now, take the money, and you can leave with your dignity intact." "And if I refuse?" Nora challenged. The rancher's expression hardened. "Then we'll see how long you last out here with no supplies, no help, and no hope of selling to anyone else. I control this valley, Miss Lancaster. One way or another, this land will be mine." Blake's hand moved slightly closer to his weapon. "You're forgetting something, Rollins. She's not alone." A cruel laugh escaped Rollins's lips. "One washed-up cowboy against my entire outfit. Those odds don't favor you, Lawson." "Maybe not," Blake conceded. "But are you willing to risk murder charges just for a parcel of land?" "Even your influence has limits." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Rollins's face before his confidence reasserted itself. "Accidents happen all the time in the wilderness. Two eastern greenhorns who didn't understand the dangers of frontier life. It would be a tragedy, but hardly suspicious." As he spoke, two of his men moved to flank the porch, cutting off any potential escape route. Nora felt fear clawing at her throat, but she stood her ground beside Blake. "This is your last chance," Rollins said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Sign the paper or face the consequences." Blake's reply was cut short by the sound of approaching riders. All heads turned to see three mounted men approaching from the eastern ridge. Rollins cursed under his breath as the newcomers came into clear view. "Marshal Wilson," Blake called out, relief evident in his voice. "Your timing couldn't be better." The lead rider, a stern-faced man wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge, surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. "Quite a gathering you've got here, Rollins. Social call, is it?" Rollins forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just discussing a business arrangement with Miss Lancaster." "With 5 armed men at sundown," the marshal raised an eyebrow. "Unusual negotiating tactics." "We were just leaving," Rollins said coldly, signaling his men to mount up. Before turning his horse, he fixed Nora with a threatening stare. "This isn't over, Miss Lancaster, not by a long shot." His gaze shifted to Blake. "And you'd best watch your back, Lawson. Men who cross me tend to meet unfortunate ends." As Rollins and his men rode away, Nora felt her knees weaken with the release of tension. Blake's steady hand on her elbow helped her maintain her composure. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, turning her attention to the marshal, who now dismounted and approached them. "Marshal Daniel Wilson," he introduced himself, "and it seems I've arrived just in time to prevent a serious situation." Blake extended his hand. "Your arrival was providential, Marshal." "May I ask what brings you to this remote corner of the territory?" "Official business that fortuitously led me past this property," Wilson replied. His weathered face suggested years of frontier law enforcement. "Though I admit, when I recognized Rollins and his men heading this way at dusk, I grew concerned. His reputation precedes him." Nora stepped forward. "I'm grateful for your intervention, Marshal Wilson, but I fear this is merely a temporary reprieve. Mr. Rollins seems determined to take my land by any means necessary." The marshal nodded gravely. "Victor Rollins has operated with impunity in this region for too long, intimidating smaller landowners and manipulating local officials, but his reach isn't as extensive as he believes." He glanced at Blake. "I take it you're helping Miss Lancaster?" "Trying to," Blake affirmed. "Her father was a good man who didn't deserve to have his legacy stolen." Marshal Wilson considered this for a moment. "I'll be in the area for at least a week conducting official business." "That should give you some breathing room, but understand I can't stay indefinitely." "A week might be enough," Blake said thoughtfully. "Time to organize some resistance against Rollins's tactics." After the marshal and his deputies departed with a promise to check in regularly, Nora and Blake returned to the cabin. The evening shadows lengthened across the floor as Blake lit a lamp. "You should eat something," he suggested, noticing how pale she looked in the lamplight. Nora shook her head. "I couldn't possibly, my nerves are too frayed." She sank into a chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the day's events. "What am I going to do, Mr. Lawson? I can't fight a man like Rollins indefinitely." Blake sat across from her, his expression serious. "First, I think after today you should call me Blake." When she nodded, he continued, "Second, you don't have to fight alone. Rollins has enemies, people he's wronged over the years, who have been too afraid to stand against him individually. You think they'd help me? Together, united against a common threat. Yes, I do." His eyes held a determination that kindled hope in Nora's heart. "Rollins maintains his power through fear and isolation. If we break that pattern, we might have a chance." Nora questioned softly. Blake met her gaze steadily. "I told you I had my reasons for opposing Rollins. 3 years ago, he drove my family off our ranch through similar tactics. My father couldn't take the humiliation. Blake's voice faltered. "He took his own life 6 months later." "I'm so sorry," Nora whispered, instinctively reaching across to touch his hand. The simple gesture of compassion seemed to steady him. "I left the territory after that, tried to outrun the guilt and anger. Worked as a ranch hand in Colorado, Wyoming, even down in Texas. But something kept pulling me back here." His eyes found hers again. "Maybe this is why." The intensity of his gaze made Nora's heart quicken. There was something about Blake Lawson that spoke of integrity and quiet strength, qualities in short supply on the frontier. "What's your plan?" she asked, withdrawing her hand self-consciously. "Tomorrow we start gathering allies. There are others in the valley who have suffered under Rollins's tyranny. Together, we might be able to break his hold on the region." Nora nodded, a new determination replacing her earlier fear. "Then we should rest. Tomorrow will be a challenging day." Blake rose, preparing to leave. "I'll sleep in the lean-to out back, keep watch through the night." "Is that necessary?" "The marshal said Rollins won't try anything tonight," Blake agreed. "But I'd feel better staying close, just in case." After he left, Nora sat alone in the quiet cabin, contemplating how drastically her life had changed in just a few short weeks. From the ordered society of Boston to this wild territory where might so often superseded right. Yet despite the danger, she felt a strange exhilaration. Here, her decisions mattered in a way they never had in Boston, where her life had been carefully prescribed by social convention. As she prepared for bed, Nora found herself thinking about Blake Lawson. There was more to his story than he had shared, she was certain. The pain in his eyes when he spoke of his father suggested wounds that had not fully healed. Yet despite his own troubles, he had chosen to stand with her against overwhelming odds. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the soft golden light that made the prairie seem almost ethereal. Nora rose early, finding Blake already awake and tending to the horses. "I hope you don't mind," he said when she approached. "I fixed that loose board on your corral. Wouldn't want your mare wandering off." "Thank you," Nora replied, noticing how the morning light caught the golden highlights in his brown hair. "Have you eaten? I could prepare something." Blake smiled, the expression transforming his solemn features. "I wouldn't turn down a cup of coffee if you're offering." Over a simple breakfast of coffee, biscuits, and preserves, they discussed their strategy for the day. Blake suggested they begin with a visit to the McDowell farm, about 5 miles east. "Ian McDowell has no love for Rollins," Blake explained. "The man diverted a creek that used to water McDowell's southeastern pastures, nearly ruined him last summer during the drought." "Will he help us?" Nora asked. Blake's expression was thoughtful. "McDowell's proud and he's been fighting his battles alone, but if we can convince him that standing together gives us all a better chance." They set out after breakfast, riding side by side across the rolling grassland. The day was clear, with a bright blue sky stretching endlessly above them. Under different circumstances, Nora might have found it beautiful. "How long have you been back in the territory?" she asked as they rode, curious to know more about the man who had become her unexpected ally. About 8 months, Blake answered, his eyes scanning the horizon, a habit of caution that seemed ingrained. Bought a small place north of here, just enough land for raising a few horses, nothing that would attract Rollins's attention. You're a horse breeder, a smile touched his lips. I have a way with horses, always have since I was a boy. They respond to patience and consistency, qualities that serve well in many aspects of life. My father would have agreed with you, Nora said softly. He always said that character reveals itself in how a person treats those with no power to resist. Blake nodded appreciatively. A wise perspective. The McDowell farm came into view as they crested a gentle slope. Unlike Nora's modest homestead, this was an established operation with several outbuildings, a substantial barn, and a 2-story farmhouse. Fields of wheat stretched to the east, while cattle grazed in pastures to the north. Ian McDowell met them in the yard, his weathered face suspicious beneath a shock of gray hair. Recognition dawned when he saw Blake. Lawson, didn't expect to see you riding this direction. His sharp eyes moved to Nora. And who might this be? Nora Lancaster, Blake introduced her. Charles Lancaster's daughter. McDowell's expression softened slightly. Charles was a good man. Sorry about your loss, miss. Thank you, Mr. McDowell, Nora replied. I've come to continue my father's work. The farmer's bushy eyebrows rose. Have you now? Bold decision for a young woman alone. That's partly why we're here, Blake interjected. Rollins has already made his move against Miss Lancaster's property, same tactics he's used before. McDowell's face darkened. Rollins, he spat the name like a curse. That snake has been squeezing the life out of this valley for years. He gestured toward the house. Come inside, no sense discussing this in the open. Inside the comfortable farmhouse, they were introduced to Sarah McDowell, Ian's wife of 30 years. She insisted on serving them coffee and freshly baked bread while they talked. Rollins came to the cabin last night with his men, Blake explained. Would have forced Miss Lancaster to sign over her deed if Marshal Wilson hadn't happened by. Ian leaned forward, intrigued. Daniel Wilson. The federal marshal, Blake nodded. He's in the area on other business, but his presence bought us some time, maybe a week. And what do you propose to do with this time? Ian asked, skepticism evident in his tone. Unite those who have suffered under Rollins's tactics, Nora answered before Blake could speak. Create a coalition strong enough that he can't intimidate us individually. Ian exchanged a look with his wife. It's been tried before. 3 years ago, a group of small ranchers banded together to protest Rollins's damming of Cottonwood Creek. 2 ended up dead in accidents, the others sold out and left the territory. This time could be different, Blake insisted. With Marshal Wilson's presence, Rollins will need to be more cautious, and if enough people stand together, he can't target everyone. It's a risk, Ian said bluntly. Sarah McDowell, who had been quiet until now, placed her hand on her husband's arm. We've talked about leaving, Ian. Selling the farm and starting over somewhere else. But this land has been in your family for 2 generations. Is that the legacy we want to leave? The farmer's expression grew conflicted. What exactly are you asking of us, Lawson? For now, just solidarity, Blake replied. If Rollins threatens one of us, we all respond. Together, we present a united front that makes his usual tactics too costly to pursue. After a long moment of consideration, Ian nodded slowly. I'm not promising anything beyond moral support at this stage, but I'll listen to what you're proposing. That's all we ask, Nora said gratefully. Over the next 2 days, Nora and Blake visited other homesteaders and small ranchers in the valley. Some, like the McDowell, had directly experienced Rollins's ruthless methods. Others had heard stories and lived in fear that they would be his next targets. With each conversation, Blake outlined his vision of mutual protection and support. By the 3rd day, they had secured tentative agreements from 7 families to meet at Nora's cabin to discuss a formal alliance. As they rode back from their final visit, Nora felt a cautious optimism beginning to blossom. Do you think it will work? She asked Blake as the late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light. It has a chance, he replied honestly. More than any of us would have alone. They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Nora found herself stealing glances at Blake's profile, struck by how natural it felt to ride beside him, to plan and hope together. In just a few days, he had become essential to her sense of possibility in this harsh new world. "Tell me about your life before Montana," she said, curious to know more about the man who had become her champion. Blake's expression turned reflective. "My father was a career cavalry officer until a Comanche arrow took his leg during a skirmish in Texas. After that, he decided to stake a claim in Montana territory, brought my mother and me north when I was 15. A faint smile touched his lips. It was hard country, but good country. The kind of place where a man could build something meaningful. And your mother, passed 5 years ago, pneumonia took her during a particularly harsh winter." His voice held the quiet resignation of someone who had faced loss and continued on. "After that, it was just my father and me working the ranch until Rollins set his sights on our water rights." Nora nodded sympathetically. "And after your father, after he was gone, where did you go?" "Drifted mostly. Took work where I could find it. I've punched cattle from the Dakotas to the Rio Grande." His eyes met hers briefly. "Never found a place that felt like home again, not until recently." Something in his tone made Nora's heart beat faster, but before she could respond, Blake suddenly reined his horse to a halt, his posture alert. "What is it?" she asked, immediately concerned. "Smoke," he said tersely, pointing toward the horizon where a dark smudge marred the clear blue sky. "Coming from the direction of your homestead." Fear clutched at Nora's heart as they urged their horses into a gallop. As they drew nearer, the source of the smoke became horrifyingly clear. Her father's cabin was engulfed in flames. "No," Nora cried as they reached the property. The fire had already consumed most of the structure, hungry flames devouring the dry timber. Blake leapt from his horse and rushed toward the burning building, but the heat forced him back. "It's too far gone," he shouted over the roar of the fire. "There's nothing we can do." Nora dismounted, her legs barely supporting her as she watched her father's legacy and her future disappear in smoke and flame. "Rollins," she whispered, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. Blake's expression hardened as he scanned the surrounding area. "Had to be. This is his answer to our organizing efforts." His eyes fell on something near the burning cabin, and he strode toward it. A wooden stake had been driven into the ground, a piece of paper nailed to it. Blake tore it free and brought it back to Nora. "Property condemned by order of the Copper Creek Development Association," Nora read aloud, her voice shaking with fury. "This is a fabrication. There is no such authority." "Rollins created it," Blake said grimly. "Probably got the sheriff and mayor to sign off on it. It's how he operates, a veneer of legality covering raw intimidation." Nora stared at the burning remnants of the cabin, devastation giving way to a cold anger. "He thinks this will make me give up, won't it?" Blake asked quietly. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the flames. "No. This only strengthens my resolve. My father believed in this land enough to die for it. I won't dishonor his memory by abandoning it at the first serious challenge." Admiration flickered across Blake's face. "Then we need to move quickly. The meeting we planned for tomorrow needs to happen tonight. Rollins has escalated the situation, and our response needs to match his urgency." As darkness fell, they made a makeshift camp a safe distance from the smoldering ruins. Blake rode out immediately to spread word about the change of plans, returning 2 hours later with news that the McDowells had offered their barn as a meeting place. "It's larger than your cabin was anyway," he said, attempting to lighten the somber mood as they rode toward the McDowell farm. "Better suited for the gathering we've planned." By the time they arrived, several wagons and horses already filled the yard. Inside the spacious barn, lanterns illuminated the serious faces of nearly 20 local residents, more than they had expected. Word of the burning had spread quickly, galvanizing support from families who had been hesitant before. Ian McDowell called the assembly to order. "Most of you know why we're here tonight. Victor Rollins has crossed a line by burning Miss Lancaster's cabin. If we don't take a stand now, any one of us could be next. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Blake stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. For too long, Rollins has controlled this valley through fear and isolation. He targets individual landowners, making each feel alone in their struggle. His clear voice carried to every corner of the barn. But tonight, we change that dynamic. Tonight, we declare that an attack on one of us is an attack on all. "Fine words," called out Jacob Turner, a grizzled rancher from the Western Ridge. "But how exactly do we stand against Rollins and his small army of gun hands? Most of us are farmers and small ranchers, not fighters." Blake nodded, acknowledging the valid concern. "We don't need to outgun him. We need to make his tactics too costly to pursue. When he threatens one property, all of us respond. We create a constant presence that makes it impossible for him to intimidate anyone without witnesses." "A neighborhood watch of sorts," Sarah McDowell suggested. "Exactly," Nora stepped forward to stand beside Blake. "And we document everything, every threat, every accident, every false legal claim. Marshal Wilson has agreed to take our evidence to the territorial governor if necessary." The discussion continued for hours, refining the strategy and addressing concerns. By midnight, they had established a communication system using riders to alert the community to any sign of Rollins's interference. They created rotating watch schedules and designated safe houses where anyone under threat could seek temporary refuge. As the meeting concluded, Nora felt a renewed sense of purpose. The destruction of her cabin, rather than defeating her, had created an opportunity to build something even more significant: a community united against tyranny. "You were magnificent in there," Blake said quietly as they stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds. "I merely spoke the truth," Nora replied, though his praise warmed her. "These people needed to know they're not alone. That's more significant than you might realize." Blake's voice was thoughtful as he gazed upward. "Isolation is the frontier's greatest threat, not Indians or harsh weather or even men like Rollins. It's the feeling that you're facing the wilderness alone that breaks most settlers." Nora studied his profile in the moonlight, struck by the wisdom in his words. "Is that what happened to your father? He felt alone in his fight." Blake was silent for a long moment. "My father was a proud man, too proud to ask for help even when he needed it desperately." His eyes found hers in the darkness. "I won't make the same mistake." The intensity of his gaze made Nora's breath catch. In that moment, she realized how quickly this man had become important to her, not just as an ally against Rollins, but as someone whose approval and admiration she valued deeply. The McDowells insisted that Nora stay with them until other arrangements could be made. Blake reluctantly agreed to return to his own ranch to check on his horses, promising to return the following day. "Be vigilant," he warned as he prepared to leave. "Rollins won't take this organization lightly. He'll try to break us before we gain too much momentum." His prediction proved accurate sooner than anyone anticipated. The next morning, Jacob Turner's son rode into the McDowell farm with alarming news. Rollins's men had set up a blockade on the main road into Copper Creek, turning back any farmers or ranchers attempting to bring goods to market. "They claim there's a quarantine," young Michael Turner reported breathlessly. "Say the territorial health officer ordered it because of an outbreak of hoof and mouth disease. It's nonsense, of course, just Rollins's way of cutting off our commerce." Ian McDowell's face darkened with anger. "He's striking at our livelihoods now. Many of us depend on selling our produce and livestock in town." "That's his strategy," Blake confirmed when he arrived an hour later. "Economic pressure to force compliance. It's effective because it's difficult to prove malicious intent." The newly formed coalition gathered again that afternoon to address this latest challenge. After much debate, they developed a plan to establish an alternative market day at the McDowell farm, bypassing Copper Creek entirely. Riders were dispatched to neighboring settlements, inviting buyers to come directly to the source for goods. "It's a temporary solution," Blake acknowledged, "but it demonstrates our adaptability. Rollins expects us to fracture under pressure." The alternative market proved surprisingly successful. By the week's end, merchants from as far away as Helena had made the journey to purchase directly from the coalition's farms and ranches. What had begun as a defensive measure was evolving into a profitable new arrangement that circumvented Rollins's influence in Copper Creek. This success, however, only intensified Rollins's determination to break the coalition. Reports came in daily of increasing intimidation, fences cut, livestock scattered, anonymous threats nailed to doors in the night. Through it all, Blake remained constantly at Nora's side, his unwavering support giving her strength when doubts threatened to overwhelm her. They spent long days riding from homestead to homestead, reinforcing the coalition's unity and developing strategies to counter Rollins's tactics. During these rides, Nora found herself drawn ever closer to Blake. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of frontier survival to deeper discussions of hopes and dreams. She learned about his love of literature, a passion nurtured by his mother who had insisted on bringing a small library of classics with them from the East. He, in turn, discovered her talent for sketching, evidenced by the small notebook she had fortunately kept in her saddlebag the day of the fire. "You have a gift," he told her sincerely when she shyly showed him her drawings of the Montana landscape. "You capture not just what this country looks like, but what it feels like." His words pleased her more than she cared to admit, even to herself. One evening, as they returned from visiting the Turner Ranch, a sudden summer storm forced them to seek shelter in an abandoned line shack. The small, one-room structure was dusty but sound, offering protection from the driving rain and spectacular lightning that illuminated the prairie. Blake quickly built a small fire in the stone hearth, while Nora shook out the single blanket she found on a crude shelf. "It appears we'll be waiting out the storm here," she observed, trying to ignore the impropriety of their situation. A proper Boston lady would never find herself alone in such circumstances with a man who wasn't her husband or relative. But Boston's rigid social codes seemed increasingly irrelevant in this new life. Here, practicality often superseded propriety, and survival required flexibility that Eastern society would never countenance. Blake seemed to read her thoughts. "You're adapting well to frontier life," he commented as he fed another stick to the small fire. "Many Eastern women never manage the transition." Nora settled on a rough wooden stool, extending her hands toward the warmth of the flames. "I had little choice. It was either adapt or return to Boston defeated." "There would have been no shame in returning," Blake said quietly. "The decision to stay, despite everything Rollins has thrown at you, speaks to your character." "Or my stubbornness," she replied with a small smile. Blake laughed, the sound rich and warm in the confined space. "Perhaps both. I've noticed that the qualities that serve best on the frontier often have two sides: stubbornness and determination, caution and cowardice, bravery and foolhardiness. The difference lies mainly in the outcome. And which am I exhibiting, do you think?" Nora asked, genuinely curious about his assessment. His blue eyes met hers across the fire, suddenly serious. "Courage, unquestionably courage." The simple declaration touched her deeply. Coming from Blake, a man who embodied the frontier virtues of strength, integrity, and resilience, such praise felt particularly meaningful. They fell into comfortable silence, listening to the rain drum against the rough-hewn roof. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the interior of the shack, casting dramatic shadows across the weathered walls. "May I ask you something personal?" Nora finally ventured, breaking the silence. Blake nodded, his expression open. "Of course." "In all our conversations about the future, you've never mentioned your own plans. Do you intend to stay in Montana territory indefinitely?" A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "For years after my father died, I couldn't imagine settling anywhere. The restlessness in my blood wouldn't allow it." He paused, adding another stick to the fire. "But recently I've started to think differently." "What changed?" Nora asked softly. Blake's eyes found hers again, and the intensity in them made her heart quicken. "I found a reason to stay." The implication in his words and gaze was unmistakable. Heat that had nothing to do with the fire rose to Nora's cheeks, and she looked away, suddenly flustered by the direction of the conversation. Blake seemed to sense her discomfort and gracefully changed the subject. The storm is easing. We should be able to continue to the McDowells within the hour. By the time they reached the farm, evening was falling. Sarah McDowell met them at the door with concern etched on her kind face. "Thank heavens you're safe. We were beginning to worry when the storm hit." She ushered them inside, where the delicious aroma of beef stew permeated the warm kitchen. "You must be famished. Sit down and eat while you tell us the news from the Turners." Over dinner, Blake relayed Jacob Turner's report that Rollins had hired additional men from as far away as Wyoming. "He's building his forces," Blake concluded grimly. "Preparing for something significant." Ian frowned, setting down his spoon. "Marshal Wilson's week is almost up, once he leaves the territory." "We knew this protection was temporary," Blake reminded them. "Our strategy doesn't depend on the Marshal's presence." "Perhaps not," Sarah interjected, "but it certainly helped restrain Rollins's more aggressive tendencies." Nora nodded in agreement. "We should ask Marshal Wilson to extend his stay if possible." "I'll ride into town tomorrow and speak with him," Blake offered. "At minimum, we need to update him on Rollins's escalation." The next morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having washed the world clean. Nora insisted on accompanying Blake to Copper Creek despite his concerns about potential danger. "We're stronger together," she reminded him. "Isn't that what we've been telling everyone?" He couldn't argue with his own logic, and they set out after breakfast, arriving in town by mid-morning. Copper Creek appeared unusually quiet for a market day, with fewer wagons and shoppers than normal evidence that Rollins's blockade tactics were affecting commerce. As they tied their horses outside the marshal's office, Nora noticed several unfamiliar men watching them from the saloon across the street. Their hard expressions and the way they lounged with deliberate casualness marked them as gunmen rather than ordinary cowboys or settlers. "Rollins's new hires," Blake murmured, following her gaze. "Keep close to me." Inside the marshal's office, they found not Wilson but Sheriff Miller, his feet propped on the desk as he cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife. "Marshal Wilson rode out yesterday," he informed them with obvious satisfaction. "Got called to Helena on urgent business, left me in charge of maintaining order." The news hit Nora like a physical blow. Without the marshal's presence, Rollins would feel free to escalate his campaign against the coalition. "We need to report ongoing intimidation and property damage," Blake said firmly, refusing to show concern at this development. "Several farms have experienced suspicious incidents in the past week." Sheriff Miller's expression remained impassive. "File a formal complaint. I'll look into it when I have time." His tone made it clear that time would never materialize. As they turned to leave, the sheriff added casually, "I'd be careful stirring up trouble, Lawson. Rollins isn't a man who forgives those who interfere with his business." Outside, Blake's expression was grim. "That confirms it. With Wilson gone, Rollins will make his move soon." They were halfway to their horses when a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Miss Lancaster, just the lady I wanted to see." Victor Rollins strode toward them, flanked by two of the gunmen Nora had noticed earlier. His smile was predatory, his confidence palpable as he blocked their path. "I heard about the unfortunate fire at your property," he said with mock sympathy. "A terrible tragedy, but perhaps a sign that Montana Territory isn't the place for a refined Eastern lady." "Strange how tragedy follows wherever you go, Rollins," Blake replied coldly. Rollins ignored him, keeping his attention fixed on Nora. "I'm still willing to make a generous offer for your land, Miss Lancaster, more than generous considering there's nothing left on it but ashes." "The land itself remains valuable," Nora replied steadily. "And it's not for sale, not to you, not to anyone." A dangerous light flashed in Rollins's eyes. "Your stubbornness is becoming tiresome. This pointless resistance you've organized among the smaller landholders can't last. Already some are reconsidering their position." "Is that why you've imported gunmen?" Blake challenged. To help them reconsider, Rollins finally acknowledged him with a contemptuous glance. Lawson, you're becoming a persistent irritation, just like your father before you. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. We both know how that ended. Blake's hand moved instinctively toward his holster, but Nora placed a restraining touch on his arm. Starting a gunfight in the middle of Copper Creek would only play into Rollins's hands. We're leaving now, she said firmly, meeting Rollins's gaze without flinching. And your threats change nothing. The coalition stands united. As they moved to step around him, Rollins's men shifted to block their path again. The tension in the air thickened as Blake's posture stiffened, preparing for confrontation. Is there a problem here? Came a new voice, deep and authoritative. Nora turned to see Marshal Wilson approaching, very much still in Copper Creek despite the sheriff's claim. Relief flooded through her at the sight of his stern face and federal badge. Rollins's expression flickered with surprise before smoothing into bland cordiality. No problem at all, Marshal. Just greeting Miss Lancaster and expressing my condolences about her cabin. Wilson's skeptical gaze moved between the parties, looked more like intimidation from where I was standing. A misunderstanding, Rollins replied smoothly. With a curt nod to his men, he stepped aside. Good day, Marshal, Miss Lancaster. He deliberately excluded Blake from his farewell, a small but pointed slight. As Rollins and his men retreated toward the saloon, Marshal Wilson turned to Blake and Nora. Let's talk inside, he suggested, gesturing toward his office. Once inside, Wilson explained that he had indeed received orders to return to Helena, but had delayed his departure after hearing rumors of increasing tensions in Copper Creek. Sheriff Miller is either incompetent or complicit, Wilson said bluntly. Probably both. He told me you'd left the territory. Miss Lancaster claimed you'd sold your land and taken the morning stage east. He's actively working with Rollins, Blake concluded. Wilson nodded grimly. I've suspected as much for some time. Unfortunately, local law enforcement falls outside my jurisdiction unless federal laws are being broken. So there's nothing you can do? Nora asked, disappointment evident in her voice. I didn't say that. Wilson's weathered face creased in a slight smile. I can delay my departure another 3 days on administrative grounds, and I can make sure certain telegrams reach the territorial governor's office regarding potential corruption in Copper Creek. It wasn't the comprehensive solution they'd hoped for, but it was something. They left the marshal's office with renewed determination to strengthen the coalition during the brief reprieve Wilson's continued presence would provide. As they rode back to the McDowell farm, Blake outlined his concerns. Rollins was too confident. He knows something we don't, probably that one or more coalition members are wavering or have already agreed to sell out. Who would break faith after coming so far together? Nora wondered aloud. Fear is a powerful motivator, Blake replied soberly, and Rollins excels at cultivating it. Their suspicions were confirmed that evening when Michael Turner arrived at the McDowell farm with troubling news. 3 families from the northeastern section of the valley had withdrawn from the coalition and signed agreements to sell their land to Rollins. Father says they were offered triple market value, the young man reported, and when they still hesitated, Rollins threatened their children. Ian McDowell slammed his fist on the table. Cowards. No, Blake contradicted him quietly, just parents protecting their families. We can't blame them for making an impossible choice. The defections, while understandable, created a strategic problem. The northeastern properties formed a crucial buffer between Rollins's main ranch and the remaining coalition lands. With that territory under his control, he could more easily isolate and pressure the others. We need to consolidate our defensive efforts, Blake advised the group that had gathered to discuss this development. Focus on maintaining a unified presence around the core properties, including the Lancaster claim. Nora, who had been listening intently, suddenly straightened. My claim is the key, isn't it? The reason Rollins targeted me first, Blake nodded slowly. Your father's land bridges the gap between Rollins's northern pastures and the water access he needs for expansion. If he controls your property, he can effectively surround the remaining independent landholders. Then we make our stand there, Nora decided. We rebuild on my land not just a cabin, but a proper house, a visible, permanent symbol of resistance. The idea caught fire among the coalition members. By morning, plans had been drawn for a building party to commence the following day. Men would contribute labor, women would prepare food, and together they would raise a structure that declared their intention to remain. Blake initially expressed concerns about Nora returning to the property before adequate defenses were in place. Rollins will see this as a direct challenge. He'll respond aggressively. Let him, Nora replied with quiet determination. We can't win by constantly reacting to his threats. It's time to assert our own vision for this valley's future. Her conviction was so compelling that Blake found himself nodding in agreement. Then we'll need to prepare accordingly. A building party is also a vulnerable target. The next 2 days were spent in careful preparation. Lumber was salvaged from abandoned structures or cut fresh from coalition woodlots. Tools were gathered, food prepared, and a rotating guard schedule established to ensure security during the construction. On the morning the building was to begin, nearly 40 people assembled at Nora's property, the largest gathering the coalition had managed since its formation. The mood was one of determined optimism as teams organized themselves for different tasks. Blake had arrived before dawn to scout the area and ensure no unwelcome surprises awaited them. He found Nora already there, standing amidst the ashes of her former cabin, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky with gold and crimson. "You're up early," he commented, dismounting to join her. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too many thoughts crowding my mind." Blake studied her profile, noting the quiet strength that had become increasingly evident during their weeks of struggle. Having second thoughts about this strategy? No, her answer came without hesitation. "This is right, I feel it. We're not just building a house today, we're building a future free from Rollins's tyranny." The simple conviction in her voice stirred something deep within Blake. Without planning to, he reached for her hand, enfolding it in his own. "Your father would be proud of you, Nora, I know I am." She turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with emotion in the dawn light. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Blake. You've given me strength when mine faltered, hope when circumstances seemed hopeless." Their gazes held, the connection between them deepening in a moment of perfect understanding. Blake felt himself drawing closer to her, drawn by a force as natural and inevitable as gravity. The sound of approaching wagons broke the spell. Reluctantly, they stepped apart as the first vehicles crested the hill, loaded with lumber and eager volunteers. The day unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Men worked in teams to clear the foundation, set corner posts, and raise wall frames. Women kept everyone fed and hydrated while maintaining a watchful eye on the surrounding countryside. Children too young for construction tasks became messengers, running between work groups with tools or information. By mid-afternoon, the basic structure had taken shape, a modest but sturdy 2-room cabin with a covered porch. It was larger than Nora's original dwelling and positioned to provide better views of approaching riders from all directions. Blake worked tirelessly alongside the other men, his skill with tools evident in the precision of his carpentry. Occasionally, he would catch Nora watching him, a thoughtful expression on her face that made his heart beat faster despite the physical exertion. As the sun began its westward descent, Ian McDowell called for a brief rest. The workers gathered in the shade of several large wagons, sharing water and Sarah McDowell's fresh bread. "We've made good progress," Ian observed with satisfaction. "Another few hours and the roof will be on." By tomorrow evening, Miss Lancaster could be sleeping in her new home. The positive assessment raised spirits even higher. As the workers prepared to return to their tasks, Blake noticed a dust cloud rising in the distance, approaching rapidly from the direction of Copper Creek. "Riders coming," he announced, his hand moving instinctively to his holster. At least a dozen, moving fast. A tense silence fell over the gathering as all eyes turned toward the approaching horsemen, There was little doubt about who led them. "Get the women and children to the wagons," Blake ordered calmly. "Men with firearms, spread out but don't draw unless necessary. We want to present a united front, not provoke a gunfight." Nora moved to stand beside him as the coalition members followed his instructions. "This is my land and my fight," she said quietly. "I should be the one to face him first." Blake wanted to object to protect her from whatever confrontation was approaching, but he recognized the determination in her stance. "Together, then," he conceded. The riders came into clear view, and Blake's assessment proved accurate. Victor Rollins led a group of 15 men, all armed, all wearing expressions that ranged from grim determination to anticipatory excitement. They reined to a halt about 50 yards from the construction site, creating an imposing line of horseflesh and weaponry. Rollins urged his mount forward a few paces, his cold gaze taking in the partially completed cabin and the assembled coalition members. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Quite the barn-raising you've got here, Miss Lancaster. Shame it's all for nothing." Nora stepped forward, her spine straight, her voice clear. "This is legal construction on legally owned property, Mr. Rollins. We have every right to be here." Rollins reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "That's where you're mistaken. This land has been condemned by order of the Territorial Health Department. Construction is prohibited until an investigation into possible contamination is completed." "Another fabrication," Blake said loudly enough for all to hear. Just like the Quarantine and the Development Authority, Rollins's expression darkened. "Watch your tongue, Lawson. I've had about enough of your interference." His gaze swept the assembled group. "All of you are trespassing on condemned property. I'm authorized to clear this land by whatever means necessary." Ian McDowell stepped forward to stand beside Nora and Blake. "We don't recognize your authority, Rollins, or your falsified documents. This coalition stands with Miss Lancaster." Murmurs of agreement rose from the gathered coalition members, many of whom had moved to form a protective semicircle around Nora. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, the tension palpable in the late afternoon air. Rollins's men shifted in their saddles, hands hovering near weapons, waiting for their employer's command. "This is your final warning," Rollins said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Clear this property now or face the consequences." No one moved. The coalition members held their ground, presenting a united front against the mounted force, Rollins's face contorted with rage at this defiance. He turned to his men. "Clear them out, destroy whatever they've built." As his gunmen moved to dismount, a new voice cut through the tension. "That would be unwise, Rollins." All heads turned to see Marshal Wilson riding toward them from the eastern approach, accompanied by 2 deputies. The federal lawman's timing once again proved impeccable. "This is none of your concern, Marshal," Rollins snapped. "This is local business." Wilson reined his horse to a halt between the opposing groups. "Threatening peaceful citizens on their own property becomes my concern when it breaches the peace of the territory." His cool gaze assessed the situation. "Especially when those threats are backed by falsified documents claiming territorial authority." Rollins's expression revealed momentary uncertainty. "You have no jurisdiction here." "Actually, I do." Wilson reached into his coat and produced an official-looking document of his own. "I've received direct authorization from the territorial governor to investigate allegations of corruption and intimidation in Copper Creek and surrounding areas, including the use of forged government documents." This revelation sent a ripple of reaction through both groups. Rollins's men exchanged uneasy glances while hope kindled in the faces of the coalition members. "That's absurd," Rollins blustered, though with noticeably less conviction. "I have legitimate business interests that are being obstructed by these people." "Then you can present your grievances through proper legal channels," Wilson replied evenly. "But this show of force ends now. Order your men to withdraw, Rollins." For a long, tense moment, it seemed Rollins might defy even federal authority. His face flushed with anger, his hand hovering near his holster as he visibly calculated his options. Finally, practicality overcame pride. "This isn't over," he growled, turning his horse abruptly. With a sharp gesture to his men, he spurred his mount and rode away, his contingent following in a cloud of dust. A collective exhalation of relief passed through the coalition as the immediate threat receded. Marshal Wilson dismounted and approached Blake and Nora. "That was too close," he said grimly. "Rollins was prepared to force a violent confrontation." "How did you know to come?" Nora asked, still trying to process how narrowly they had avoided bloodshed. "I didn't," Wilson admitted. "I was on my way to inform you that I received a response to my telegrams. The governor has authorized a formal investigation into Rollins's activities and Sheriff Miller's conduct." Blake's expression showed cautious optimism. "That's significant. How long will the investigation take?" "Weeks, possibly months," Wilson replied honestly. "But in the meantime, I have authority to remain in the area and ensure no further intimidation occurs." This news sparked renewed determination among the coalition members. With the immediate threat neutralized and federal protection extended, they returned to the construction work with fresh energy. By nightfall, the roof was in place, and the basic structure was secure enough to be completed the following day. As darkness fell, most of the workers departed for their own homes, leaving a smaller contingent to camp at the site as a precaution against any return by Rollins or his men. Nora insisted on staying despite Blake's concerns for her safety. "This is my home," she said simply. "I won't be driven from it again." Blake couldn't argue with her logic, so he arranged for her to sleep in Sarah McDowell's wagon while he and several other men maintained a watch through the night. The night passed peacefully under a canopy of brilliant stars. When dawn painted the eastern horizon with delicate rose and gold, the remaining workers arose to continue their labor. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was essentially complete, simple but sturdy, with glass windows salvaged from an abandoned stage station and a proper stone chimney. As the coalition members prepared to depart, leaving Nora to settle into her new home, Ian McDowell presented her with a handcrafted rocking chair. "Sarah insisted," he explained with a smile, "said every proper home needs one." Nora embraced the older woman, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. "I can never thank all of you enough for what you've done." "You united us," Sarah replied simply. "Gave us the courage to stand together against Rollins's tyranny." "This cabin represents more than just your home. It's a symbol of what we can accomplish together." As the wagons and riders departed, Nora found herself alone with Blake, who had remained behind to complete a few final details on the porch railing. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked, suddenly shy in his presence despite all they had faced together. "It's the least I can offer after everything you've done." Blake's smile warmed his blue eyes. "I'd like that very much." They prepared a simple meal together in the new cabin's small kitchen area. The domesticity of the task felt surprisingly natural, as if they had shared such moments many times before. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences that required no filling. As they ate by lamplight at the small table Ian and his sons had built, Nora found herself studying Blake's face, noting how the golden illumination softened his features and highlighted the weariness that weeks of vigilance had etched there. "You look tired," she observed softly. "It's been a demanding time," he acknowledged, "for all of us. Yet you never wavered, never suggested giving up or taking an easier path." Blake met her gaze across the table. "Some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that extended far beyond their struggle against Rollins. Nora felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest as she recognized the deeper current flowing beneath their conversation. "Blake," she began hesitantly, "when this is truly over, when Rollins no longer threatens the valley, what will you do?" He was silent for a moment, considering her question with the thoughtfulness she had come to expect from him. "I've given that some thought recently. My horse ranch could be something more with the right investment and attention. Montana territory is growing. Good horses will always be needed." That sounds like a plan with promise, Nora said encouragingly. Blake nodded, his expression turning more serious. But it's only half a plan, really. A ranch needs more than just horses and pasture to be complete. His eyes held hers with gentle intensity. It needs a home, a family. The implication in his words made Nora's heart quicken. Are you speaking theoretically, Mr. Lawson, or do you have something specific in mind? A smile tugged at Blake's lips. I thought we'd moved beyond formalities, Miss Lancaster. Nora, she corrected softly. Nora. He reached across the table to take her hand in his. I've never been skilled with pretty words or grand declarations. Life on the frontier doesn't cultivate those talents. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. But these past weeks have shown me what truly matters in this world: courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand for what's right regardless of the cost. You embody all those qualities, Nora said sincerely. Blake shook his head slightly. I saw them first in you. Your determination to honor your father's legacy despite overwhelming odds, your compassion for others facing similar struggles. Your refusal to be intimidated even when faced with the destruction of everything you'd built. He rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and moved to kneel beside her. Nora's breath caught at the unexpected gesture, her pulse racing as she recognized its significance. I can't offer you the comforts or security of Boston, Blake said, his voice rough with emotion. The frontier demands much and promises little, but I can promise you this: my unwavering support, my deepest respect, and my enduring love. Tears blurred Nora's vision as the words she had scarcely dared hope for filled the quiet cabin. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Blake Lawson? His smile was tender as he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. Nora Lancaster, would you consider joining your life with mine? Building something lasting together on this wild frontier. Joy bubbled up within her, bright and effervescent as a mountain spring. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, Blake, nothing would make me happier. The kiss they shared sealed their commitment, gentle at first, then deepening with the passion that had been building between them through weeks of shared danger and growing admiration. When they finally drew apart, Nora saw in Blake's eyes the same wonder and happiness that filled her own heart. I had hoped, he admitted, but hardly dared believe you might return my feelings. You could have your pick of suitors back east, men of education and refined manners, not rough cowboys with calloused hands and uncertain prospects. Nora placed her palm against his cheek. Those men could never offer what you have given me, Blake, the courage to discover my own strength, the partner who stands beside me rather than attempting to direct my path. They talked long into the night, planning their future together while acknowledging the challenges still before them. Rollins remained a threat, though a temporarily restrained one. The investigation Marshal Wilson had initiated would take time, and its outcome couldn't be guaranteed. We'll face whatever comes together, Blake assured her as the hour grew late and he reluctantly prepared to depart for his own ranch. Propriety demanded they maintain separate residences until they could be properly married. Together, Nora agreed, the word a promise and a declaration. The following weeks brought significant changes to Copper Creek and the surrounding valley. True to his word, Marshal Wilson remained in the area, his presence ensuring that Rollins maintained a wary distance from coalition properties. The territorial investigation proceeded methodically, with investigators interviewing landowners about their experiences with Rollins's tactics. Sheriff Miller was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, replaced temporarily by a deputy marshal who showed no inclination to favor Rollins's interests. This shift in local authority emboldened more settlers to join the coalition, strengthening their collective position. Nora and Blake announced their engagement at a gathering of coalition members, receiving enthusiastic congratulations from their friends and allies. Sarah McDowell immediately began planning the wedding, insisting that the ceremony should take place in her garden once the territorial investigation concluded. A fresh beginning for all of us, she declared with satisfaction. As summer gave way to early autumn, the investigation delivered its findings. The evidence against Rollins was substantial forged documents, witness testimony of intimidation and property destruction, financial records showing suspicious transactions with local officials. The territorial governor acted decisively, ordering Rollins to face charges in Helena and appointing new officials to replace those implicated in his corruption. While the legal proceedings would take months to complete, the immediate effect was the dismantling of Rollins's power structure in Copper Creek. On a crisp October day, with aspen leaves shimmering gold against the blue Montana sky, Nora Lancaster and Blake Lawson were married in the McDowell Garden. The entire coalition attended, along with Marshall Wilson, who had delayed his return to Helena to witness the union he had helped make possible. Nora wore a simple white dress ordered from Helena, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Blake, unaccustomed to formal attire, nevertheless cut a handsome figure in a new suit purchased for the occasion. Their vows, spoken with clear voices and unwavering conviction, reflected the journey that had brought them together, promises not just of love and fidelity, but of partnership in building a future founded on justice and mutual respect. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, a joyous affirmation of community as much as a wedding feast. Music, dancing, and abundant food transformed the McDowell farm into a scene of festivity that the valley had not witnessed in years of Rollins's oppressive influence. As Blake led Nora in a dance beneath lantern light, he whispered in her ear, "Happy Mrs. Lawson." The new name sent a thrill through her. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly, "though I still can't quite believe how our paths crossed." "I can," Blake said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be despite all odds." His arms tightened around her waist as they swayed to the music. "Your father's dream hasn't been lost, you know. It simply evolved into something larger than he might have envisioned, not just a homestead, but a community founded on principles he would have cherished." Nora rested her head against his shoulder, contentment filling her heart. "He would have liked you tremendously." "And I him, from everything you've told me," Blake replied. "We'll honor his memory in how we live and what we build together." Later that night, as they rode toward Blake's ranch now, their shared home, Nora reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from Boston to this moment. The path had been neither easy nor direct, marked by loss, danger, and unexpected allies. Yet she couldn't regret a single step that had led her to Blake's side. Their arrival at the ranch was marked by a charming surprise. During the wedding celebration, friends had decorated the modest house with wildflowers and ribbons. Inside, they found new curtains hung at the windows and a wedding quilt spread across the bed, gifts from the women of the coalition. "Welcome home," Blake said softly as he carried her across the threshold, honoring the tradition despite his usual practical nature. In the privacy of their home, they discovered the depth of the connection that had been building between them through months of shared struggle. Their coming together was a tender affirmation of the love and respect that had grown from unlikely beginnings into an unshakable bond. Dawn found them standing together on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky with promise. Blake's arm around Nora's waist anchored her to this new reality, one she had never imagined when she'd first arrived in Montana territory, carrying nothing but her father's letters and a determination to honor his dream. "What shall we do today, husband?" she asked, the words still new and wonderful on her tongue. Blake smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Whatever we choose, wife, the future is ours to build one day at a time." 5 years later, Nora sat in the rocking chair that had been Sarah McDowell's wedding gift, watching Blake teach their 3-year-old son Charles to ride his first pony in the ranch yard. Their infant daughter Mary slept peacefully in a cradle beside her, her tiny features a perfect blend of her parents'. The Lawson Horse Ranch had prospered beyond their early hopes. Blake's skill with horses had attracted buyers from across the territory, and Nora's practical management had turned a modest operation into a thriving business. The original cabin on her father's land still stood, maintained as a symbolic reminder of their struggle and ultimate triumph, though they had built their family home on Blake's property. Copper Creek itself had transformed in the years since Victor Rollins's downfall. With his corrupt influence removed, the town had grown into a respectable settlement with a school, church, and several new businesses. Many of the coalition members who had stood together against tyranny remained close friends, their children growing up together in the freedom their parents had secured. As Blake lifted little Charles from the pony's back and swung him high in the air, the boy's laughter rang out across the yard, a sound of pure joy that never failed to warm Nora's heart. Blake caught her watching and smiled, his love as evident now as it had been on their wedding day. In that moment, Nora felt a profound gratitude for all that had transpired since her arrival in Montana territory. The journey had been fraught with danger and uncertainty, yet it had led her to this life of purpose and deep connection. Her father's dream of building a legacy in this wild, beautiful country had been realized, though not in the way either of them had envisioned. That legacy lived on in the community that had formed in opposition to injustice, in the family she and Blake had created, and in the principles they had defended together. As Blake approached with their son riding proudly on his shoulders, Nora rose to meet them, baby Mary cradled in her arms. The family they had built together was the most precious outcome of that fateful summer when a determined young woman from Boston and a principled cowboy had stood united against corruption and found love in the process. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Nora smiled, leaning forward to kiss him softly. "About how sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations." Blake's eyes, still as blue and clear as the Montana sky, reflected his understanding of all she left unspoken. "I wouldn't change a single step of our journey," he said quietly, "even the difficult ones." "Nor would I," Nora agreed, her heart full. Together they had transformed adversity into strength, fear into courage, and two separate lives into one shared journey that continued to unfold with each passing day on the frontier they both now called home.